Congressman Jamie Raskin walked into this hearing and absolutely tore apart FBI Director Kash Patel in a speech so brutal, so detailed, and so devastating that by the time it was over, the entire narrative around Patel's leadership looked completely shattered.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Director Patel. You and I have not had the opportunity to meet, and alas, you failed to respond to the 8 oversight letters I've sent you over the last 7 months. So we do have a lot of questions piling up for you, but I want to start with a word of praise. The first FBI director was J. Edgar Hoover, who steadfastly refused to hire women, African Americans, and other minorities as agents. And although he was a closeted homosexual who lived in domestic partnership for decades with Clyde Tolson, he also participated in anti-gay crusades. He aggressively promoted what we would today call white Christian nationalism, and he would undoubtedly be turning over in his grave to see as one of his successors a first-generation Indian American and a proud Hindu. So I congratulate you on being a breakthrough in this sense and being a beneficiary of the civil rights movement that opened up the FBI and the federal workforce to lots of people who never would have been hired in its first decades. Alas, you share J. Edgar Hoover's dangerous obsession with blind loyalty over professionalism and effective public policy. For Hoover, it was blind loyalty to him in keeping his secrets. For you, it's blind loyalty to Donald Trump in keeping his secrets. During your confirmation, it was widely noted on all sides that your primary qualification was your unwavering loyalty to Trump. Unlike other directors, you had no work experience at the FBI, but you had made over 1,000 media and political appearances in support of Trump's campaign. Your Senate confirmation vote was 51-49, the closest in history, with your opponents warning you were not qualified and had no interest in actually developing the qualifications for the job. I hoped that they were wrong. Alas, they were not. While most other new FBI directors drew on their experience as FBI agents, you didn't have that. But you did write a picture book trilogy for children ages 5 and up based on your experience clashing with President Trump's political enemies. In your book, you describe your literary alter ego, Kash the Knight, as a wacky, easily bored wizard carrying out King Donald's vengeance by driving his enemies out of the kingdom. In the books, King Donald is besieged by the evil Hillary Queentown, but saved in the end by Kash. Then Kash goes on to catch mules who are stealing the 2020 election for the great King Donald from Sleepy Joe. And then in the third book, Kash takes down the dragon of the jalapenos, nicknamed the DOJ. Your supporters had hoped that you would graduate from imagining yourself a romantic fairy tale knight to actually running America's premier federal law enforcement agency. Alas, just as we've learned how dangerous it is to put a science-denying anti-vaxxer in charge of our public health, we've learned how dangerous it is to name as director of the FBI a man who thinks of himself as a fairy tale knight who keeps a fire-breathing dragon named DOJ at home to forcibly drive villains out of the kingdom. When Charlie Kirk was assassinated, while his killer was still on the loose, you decided you didn't need to be at FBI headquarters in Washington to work with your team while the chaotic manhunt unfolded. You spent your evening dining in a swanky Midtown Manhattan restaurant and tweeting out false information that the subject of the shooting was in custody, a statement you had to retract 1 hour later. Your performance was so disturbing that even the MAGA base was alarmed. Culture warrior Christopher Rufo, who just a few months ago sat in your chair as a Republican witness, observed that you performed terribly, and he called for your ouster. The FBI might be able to survive your delusions of grandeur and the explosively volatile temper that was on display yesterday in the Senate, but the intractable problem is that you are running the FBI not as a law enforcement agency charged with keeping the American people safe, but as a political enforcement agency working directly for the president's vengeance campaign. 7 months in, it's impossible to overstate the destruction, chaos, and demoralization you've brought to the FBI and its workforce and the resulting danger your actions have caused to our country. You've been systematically purging the FBI of its most experienced and qualified agents, division leaders, and experts in counterterror, counterintelligence, and cybersecurity, precisely the people who have the expertise you lack. and which the FBI and the country need. They've been expelled from the ranks of the Bureau simply because they did their duty investigating crimes, including those committed by the mob that attacked the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and beat the hell out of more than 140 police officers, or simply because you suspected them of being insufficiently loyal to Donald Trump. You illegally sacked Brian Driscoll, the former acting director of the Bureau and a decorated counterterrorism expert who worked at the FBI for nearly 20 years. According to Driscoll, you told him your own job, quote, depended on the removal of agents who worked on the cases against the president, regardless of whether the agents chose to work on those cases or not. You added, quote, the FBI tried to put the president in jail and he hasn't forgotten it. You forced out the leader of the Salt Lake City field office, Mehtab Saeed, just weeks before Charlie Kirk's assassination, depriving the FBI of an experienced counterterrorism expert described by her colleagues as absolutely the best and legendary. She would have led the FBI's manhunt had she not been fired. When Trump decided that rounding up immigrants with no criminal records was more important than preventing crimes like human trafficking of women and girls, drug dealing, terrorism, and fraud, you ordered the 25 largest field offices to divert thousands of agents away from chasing down violent criminals, sex traffickers, fraudsters, and scammers to carry out this immigration crackdown. Director Patel, you treated the men and women at FBI with disrespect and paranoia. You've assembled a roving band of freelancing henchmen within your office and charged them with conducting unauthorized investigations, targeting and harassing career FBI employees. Amazingly, you forced senior leadership to repeatedly take polygraph tests to prove their political loyalty and pushed out leaders who refused these demeaning exercises. And now we're seeing one very clear reason why you want to build a political FBI. The Epstein files. You want an FBI blindly loyal to Trump and to you as his enforcer so you can continue your cover-up of a massive international sex trafficking ring with more than 1,000 victims, betraying all of the survivors of the sexual violence. Before you got in this job, you called for full release of the Epstein files, telling podcaster Benny Johnson that the only reason the list was not released by DOJ and FBI was, quote, because of who's on that list. Upon your confirmation, you promised that, quote, there will be no cover-ups, no missing documents, no stone left unturned. And anyone from the prior or current Bureau who undermines this will be swiftly pursued. This spring, you ordered hundreds of agents to pore over all the Epstein files, but not to look for more clues about the money network or the network of human traffickers. You pulled these agents from their regular counterterrorism or drug trafficking duties to work around the clock, some of them sleeping at their desks, to conduct a frantic search to make sure Donald Trump's name and image were flagged and redacted wherever they appeared, whether an email, a text, a letter, an interview, a photograph, or a video. In May, Attorney General Bondi reportedly told Trump that his name had indeed appeared multiple times throughout the Epstein files. And not long thereafter, in July, you and the Attorney General released a memo claiming that, quote, no further disclosure would be appropriate or warranted. In a few short months, how did you go from being a crusader for accountability and transparency for the Epstein files to being a part of the conspiracy and cover-up? The answer is simple. You said it yourself, because of who's on that list. Donald Trump's relationship with Epstein over the years is well documented. A week ago, the Oversight Committee released Trump's disturbing birthday book note to Epstein, written over a drawing of a woman's naked body, referring to a, quote, wonderful secret. The Oversight Committee obtained the note from the Epstein estate, not from the FBI, raising questions again of whether the FBI has been withholding documents. While you're unleashing the FBI to cater to Trump's desire to shut down the Epstein inquiry, the first 9 months of the Trump presidency have seen a spate of political violence and domestic terror events. We saw deadly attacks on political figures on both the left and the right. The brutal assassination of Minnesota Democratic House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, and the attempted murder of Democratic State Senator John Hoffman and his wife, who miraculously survived a combined 17 gunshots. We saw an arsonist set Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's residence on fire. And of course, last week, we saw the horrific, cold-blooded assassination of Charlie Kirk in Utah that has shaken the nation. 1 minute after Charlie Kirk was shot in the neck, a 16-year-old shooter in Evergreen, Colorado, radicalized by white supremacist ideology online, opened fire and critically wounded 2 other students at Evergreen High School. We've seen lethal anti-Semitic violence, including the murder of 2 young Israeli embassy staffers just blocks from the Capitol, and then in the attack on a gathering of Jewish people in support of hostages held in Gaza in Boulder in June. We've seen continued mass shootings at schools, like the domestic terror incident at a Catholic school in Minneapolis last month, which killed 2 children and wounded 18 others. And in August, a man fired more than 500 bullets at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, killing a police officer who was a Marine veteran and a father. People like Melissa Hortman and Charlie Kirk should be able to participate in politics as elected officials or active citizens without being shot down in cold blood in the United States of America. People should also be able to go to elementary school, to middle school, to high school, to work, to the mall, and to church without being shot down in explosions of gun violence. The important position at the FBI requires a leader who puts public safety and national security and the rule of law first. I'm afraid, Director Patel, you've given us reason to believe you've used the powers of the FBI to serve Donald Trump and his agenda of partisan retribution. You've broken your promise not to do that. You've betrayed Jeffrey Epstein's victims and survivors. You've turned your back on the career law enforcement officers of the FBI, and as a result, you've left all of us less safe than before. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That opening statement may have been...
Raskin didn't start with shouting. He started with something far more devastating: polite praise. He welcomed Patel and pointed out something that is historically true. The FBI was once run by people who openly discriminated, especially under the infamous director J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover, Raskin noted, refused to hire women, Black Americans, and other minorities as agents. The Bureau for decades reflected that exclusion. So Raskin acknowledged something important. Kash Patel, as a first-generation Indian American and a practicing Hindu, represents the kind of diversity that the old FBI leadership would have never accepted. And for a moment, it sounded like Raskin was offering genuine praise. But then the pivot came, and it hit like a truck. Because Raskin said that while Patel may represent a breakthrough in identity, he represents something deeply troubling in loyalty. According to Raskin, Patel shares the same dangerous obsession that Hoover once had: blind loyalty. Except this time, the loyalty isn't to the FBI. It's to Donald Trump. Raskin reminded everyone how Patel even became FBI director in the first place. Unlike many previous directors, Patel never served as an FBI agent. He didn't rise through the ranks of investigators, counterterrorism experts, or intelligence professionals. Instead, Raskin pointed out something stunning. Patel had made over 1,000 media appearances, defending Trump's political agenda. That, according to Raskin, was the real credential. And the confirmation vote reflected that controversy. Patel was confirmed 51-49, the closest vote for an FBI director in modern history. That's not a comfortable mandate. That's a deeply divided Senate essentially saying, "We're not sure about this guy." Raskin said many warned the time that Patel wasn't qualified. And now, 7 months later, he argued those fears were coming true. Then Raskin delivered what might have been the most surreal moment of the entire speech. He started talking about children's books. Yes, seriously. Because before running the FBI, Kash Patel wrote a series of picture books for kids. But these weren't just random children's stories. In them, Patel's fictional character, a wizard knight called Kash, fights enemies of a king named Donald. The villains include figures clearly modeled after political rivals like Hillary Clinton, and others in what Raskin described as a fantasy world, where Patel imagines himself defending the king from enemies. Raskin's point wasn't just to mock the books. His point was much darker. He argued that Patel never left that mindset behind. Instead of seeing himself as a neutral law enforcement official, Raskin said Patel still sees himself as a political knight protecting Trump's kingdom. And when the person running the FBI thinks like that, that's dangerous. Raskin then pointed to a moment he said exposed Patel's leadership. After the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, the country was on edge. A killer was still on the loose. Normally, in moments like that, the FBI director is coordinating directly with headquarters and law enforcement teams. But according to Raskin, Patel wasn't doing that. He was reportedly dining at a high-end Manhattan restaurant while the manhunt was unfolding. And worse, Patel tweeted that the suspect had already been captured. That information turned out to be false. He had to retract it an hour later. Raskin used that moment to argue that Patel wasn't behaving like the head of America's most important law enforcement agency. He was behaving like a political commentator on social media. Then the speech turned even more serious. Raskin accused Patel of systematically purging experienced FBI officials, agents who worked on investigations tied to Trump, counterterrorism experts, senior leadership, people with decades of experience. According to Raskin, these professionals were pushed out not because of misconduct, but because they were viewed as insufficiently loyal. One case Raskin highlighted was former acting FBI Director Brian Driscoll, a counterterrorism veteran who served nearly 2 decades. Raskin said Driscoll was removed after being told something chilling: that Patel's own job depended on removing agents connected to investigations involving Trump. If that claim is true, it raises enormous questions. Because the FBI is supposed to be independent, not a loyalty test. But the most explosive part of Raskin's speech came when he brought up one name: Jeffrey Epstein. Before becoming FBI director, Patel had publicly demanded full transparency about Epstein's network and the powerful people connected to it. He said the files should be released. He said the truth should come out. But Raskin says something changed once Patel took power. Instead of expanding the investigation, Raskin accused him of doing the opposite. Hundreds of agents were reportedly assigned to comb through Epstein files, not to find traffickers or financial networks, but to flag and redact references to Donald Trump. Emails, photos, texts, anything. Raskin argued that the result was a memo from Patel and Attorney General Pam Bondi, claiming that no further disclosures were necessary. Raskin's conclusion was blunt. Patel didn't abandon transparency by accident. He did it because of who might appear in those files. But Raskin didn't stop there. He zoomed out to something much bigger. America has seen a surge of political violence: attacks on Democrats, attacks on Republicans, school shootings, domestic terror incidents, anti-Semitic violence, and extremist attacks. The country is facing real threats. In moments like this, the FBI needs strong, professional leadership. A director focused on national security. A director focused on the rule of law. Not someone playing politics. And that's where Raskin delivered his final blow. He said Patel had betrayed 3 groups: the survivors of Epstein's trafficking network, the career agents inside the FBI, and the American people who depend on the Bureau for safety. Here's the thing about that speech. You don't have to agree with every single word Raskin said to understand why it landed so hard. Because the core issue he raised is one of the most serious questions a democracy can face. What happens when law enforcement becomes political? The FBI has always been controversial. Under Hoover, it abused power. During the Cold War, it surveilled activists. Over the decades, both Democrats and Republicans have accused it of bias at different times. But the principle that has always mattered most is independence. The idea that the FBI does not belong to a president, not to Republicans, not to Democrats, not to any political movement. It belongs to the rule of law. Raskin's speech was a warning that this line may be disappearing. He painted a picture of an FBI director chosen not for experience but for loyalty. A director who allegedly pushed out investigators tied to cases involving Trump. A director accused of blocking transparency on one of the largest trafficking scandals in modern history. If even a fraction of that is true, the implications are massive. Because once law enforcement becomes a tool of political power, it stops protecting the public. It starts protecting the powerful. And history shows how dangerous that can be. Countries slide into authoritarianism not overnight, but slowly. Institutions weaken. Accountability disappears. Truth becomes negotiable. And suddenly, the people who were supposed to enforce the law are working for one person instead. That's why hearings like this matter. They're messy. They're dramatic. They're political. But they're also one of the last places where power is publicly challenged. Jamie Raskin stood in that room and laid out a devastating case against the man running the FBI. Now the question is whether anyone in power is actually going to take those warnings seriously. Because if the FBI truly becomes a political enforcement arm for any president, whether it's Donald Trump or anyone else, then the damage won't just affect one administration. It will affect American democracy itself. And that's a risk the country simply cannot afford. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. Did Jamie Raskin expose something real here? Or was this just another political attack in Washington? Because this fight over the FBI is far from over.